I lived the men's 98th Gracia weekend at St. Pius X Church in Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania. I sat at the Decoria of St. Padre Pio, and I worship at Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Enola. Today's talk is on Chapter 15, Volunteerism and Commitment, of Father Frank Salmani's book entitled, Whom Shall I Send? Discerning the Will of God. It is a short 2.5 page chapter that presents us with an important message of what God expects of anyone who commits themselves to him. Father opens the chapter referring to the crowd's reaction after the Bread of Life discourse. To fully appreciate the point that the author makes, I think that it is helpful to first go back a couple of scriptural paragraphs, which is said in John chapter 6. You may recall that the Bread of Life discourse takes place shortly after the feeding of the multitude episode, in which Jesus feeds a crowd of 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Subsequently, that evening, the disciples get into the boat and proceed across the sea to Capernaum. After rowing for about 3 or 4 miles, they then see Jesus walking on the water. Excuse me. Okay, the next day, the crowd realizes that Jesus and his disciples had left. They then get into the boats and head to Capernaum and search for Jesus until they found him. We should note here that they looked for Jesus only because they wanted him to again give them the bread that perishes. Jesus told them to instead seek by faith in him the eternal food that he would provide for them in the future. He said that his Father, unlike Moses, gave the true bread from heaven, and that Jesus himself was the bread given for the life of the world. He rebuked their unbelief and said that all who believe in him will be raised on the last day. In response to the Jews questioning how one with known earthly parents could possibly be the bread from heaven, Jesus reaffirmed that those who believe in him have eternal life and proclaimed that he is the living bread from heaven, promising that anyone who eats it will live forever. He then added that the bread that he would give in the future for the life of the world was his flesh. Well, this was all a bit too much for the Jews to accept, and they angrily asked each other how he could give his flesh to eat. Jesus responded that they would have no life unless they ate his flesh and drank his blood. Jesus went on to explain that whoever ate his flesh and drank his blood had eternal life. They'd be raised on the last day and remained in him, since his flesh was true food and his blood was true drink. Just as Jesus lived by the living Father, those who consume Jesus would live by him. After reiterating that he is the bread from heaven and that imparts eternal life to whoever eats it, many of his disciples complained about how hard this teaching was. Since Jesus knew that his disciples were murmuring about this, he said to them, "Does this shock you?" And then addressed their complaints by predicting his ascension and by rebuking their materialism and unbelief. At that point, sadly, many of Jesus' disciples left him, never to walk with him again. So with this as context, Father Salmani begins chapter 15 by pointing out one of the most dramatic scenes in the Gospels, where Jesus takes a big risk, turns towards his disciples and says, "Do you also want to leave?" Whoa. Jesus is basically asking the apostles to lay their lives on the line at the moment and make up their mind as to whether they either are with him or against him. It was a risk because there was no one keeping the apostles there. While they may have been chosen, they still could have exercised their free will to walk away. As such, Father refers to the apostles as volunteers. Fortunately, this volunteer status did not negatively impact their commitment to Jesus. The 12 apostles reaffirmed their faith in his divinity, confessing that they had nowhere else to go for the words of eternal life. So how does this all apply to us? In effect, we're all volunteers just like the apostles. Do we let volunteer status influence our commitment to Jesus? How many times have you heard, "I am just a volunteer"? Do not these words translate to, "Don't expect too much of me"? or you're lucky I'm not, or you're lucky I'm doing what I'm doing? How many times do we as Cursillo leaders see our work in the church as we're just volunteers? The author points out that there are a few problems associated with the mentality of I'm just a volunteer. The principal issue is that of one setting one's own agenda. We must first recognize that what someone can give or what someone wants to give as a volunteer to a particular community or cause is not always what is needed. The danger here is that our commitment to Christ can end up being focused on the individual's agenda and not the work that needs to be done. At our baptism, we are given both a calling and a vocation to be Christ's disciples, to proclaim the good news and share in the prayer, worship, and sacrificial life of the church. Because our vocation through baptism and of our calling, we are servants and cannot be setting the tone for the master. It is the master who decides and sets a scope of work for the apostolate. It is up to God and his church to set the appropriate conditions for being a disciple, apostle, or leader. An additional twist here is that we may also view our commitment to God and his church as a free choice. And this is true to a certain extent. Given our free will, we certainly may accept or reject Christ's invitation. He does not force us to follow him. So if our response is no, then the matter is settled. If, however, the answer is yes, we may not set our own agenda. Father illustrates this setting our own agenda problem by way of a story that he was reminded of several years prior to writing the book. He relates that there was once a CCD teacher who was also a practicing psychologist. The teacher's role in the program was to prepare a group of second graders for their first penance. The job description was plain and simple, but before long, she came up with an elaborate scheme where she would call all the parents, visit them, and in fact do a psychological profile on each family. The CCD teacher, the CCD coordinator, got involved and told the teacher that her approach was outside the scope of her job and could not be supported. The teacher, upon hearing this, became indignant. In short, this is a case of someone who volunteered her time to God and his church, but brought her own agenda to the work. This, unfortunately, can happen to Cursillo leaders. We may have a desire to volunteer our time to the Cursillo movement, but on our own terms. So if we say yes to the calling and work of being a Cursillo leader, then we have to follow the agenda of the Cursillo movement, which follows the mission of the church, which in turn is an extension of Christ's mission. We cannot decide to pick and choose when it comes to doing the Lord's work. The movement cannot be linked or likened to a lunch or dinner buffet where we have the option to only take what looks good. No, we have the responsibility to accept all the terms and conditions involved and follow what the Catholic Church teaches. What the author is telling us here is that if we want to be authentic Cursillo leaders, we must not complain about the requirements that are imposed and hold firm to the essential elements of the movement. One way to think of this is that our calling to be apostles in certain respects is not that much different than the calling of the 12 apostles. Did the apostles set the conditions for discipleship? No. Did the apostles dictate to Jesus the terms of acceptance? No. And Jesus would tell the apostles where to go, what to do, and how long to stay. Did any of them ever say to Jesus, "You're expecting too much from me," or "I'm just a volunteer"? No again. Did the apostles have to accept the calling all or nothing? Absolutely. So now as then, the call to discipleship is not our own choice, and neither is the scope nor the place of the work. We are free to follow the calling or find an alternative way. If we accept, however, we must do it on the Lord's terms. When we respond to the Lord on our terms, it is no longer the Lord's work we are doing, but simply promoting our own agenda. As Cursillo leaders, then, we must always remember that our calling to be apostles comes from Jesus. If we accept the calling, we do not get to dictate the terms and conditions of the work. It is all or nothing. Our commitment must be a serious one that holds firm to the essential elements of the movement. So to those who are tempted to backslide or turn away in their commitment because they view their work in the church as, I am just a volunteer, or because they are having thoughts of, don't expect too much of me, or you're lucky I'm doing what I'm doing, it may be a good time to pause briefly and reflect back to the moment when Jesus had just completed the Bread of Life discourse. In the face of crisis, produced by his words and his gestures, Jesus turns towards his most intimate friends, represented by the 12, and says, do you want to leave? To which Simon Peter responded so beautifully, Master, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. De Chloris.